It gives me great pleasure to welcome James Downs to this video podcast that we're recording for Eating Disorder Awareness Week. Welcome, James, and thanks ever so much for joining Cwmtaf Morgannwg Mind in this conversation to raise awareness on eating disorders.
Hi, nice to be here.
I think by way of introduction, James, I think it's perhaps worth us just reflecting on some of the things that we know about you. So we know through your LinkedIn profile that you're a significant campaigner for eating disorders across the UK. We know that you've started your career in the health and social care sphere as a healthcare support worker and nursing assistant whilst you were living in Cardiff. But you've clearly moved on, and you're involved as a lived experience designer with Mind. We've met each other previously on the Mind's grant panel, particularly through the COVID recovery grants that we were both involved in. We know that you're a campaigner, a media representative, and a lived experience expert. You're a regular blogger around mental health and eating disorders. You've previously co-chaired the NHS Clinical Network for Eating Disorders in East England. Before then, moving to Cambridge, in University of Cambridge, doing your psychology degree. And we know that you're a professional yoga teacher. So you're very busy in your personal life, and it's clear that you have a passion and commitment for mental health and eating disorders in terms of your blogging and everything that you talk about. Do you just want to reflect on all of that stuff that you're involved in, just to give us a sense of why you do that and what you want to achieve from that?
Yeah, that was a long list of things, wasn't it? And I was a bit scared when you said we're going to start by the things you know about me. I was like, what do they know about me? I think that, yeah, like you said, I started off when I was younger working in a nursing home and working in caring roles, which I really loved. But that wasn't my original plan. I always wanted to do music when I was growing up. And
Right.
I applied to university and I got a place at Cambridge. I was really lucky when I was 17, and I could never come to university because I was so unwell with eating disorders. And so I kind of took the only job that was going at the time, which was working in a nursing home. And I don't regret it at all. I think it gave me a massive insight into like looking after really vulnerable people. And it was a real privilege to do that job. And I think, about the last year and the difficulties care homes have been through in the last year. And I'm sort of glad that I'm not doing that job now, but I think it was a really important part of my life. And I think that I realized, that I can care for other people and I can make a difference to other people. But at the same time, I can't do that if I'm not very well myself.
Mm.
So I've done lots of different roles, like you said, in the area of mental health and eating disorders. But I think alongside that, and we'll talk a lot more about that, I'm sure, I think my biggest job of my life has been my recovery and sort of staying well. So all these other jobs, they look impressive on paper, but I think that the hardest thing I've ever done is sort of working on recovery from an eating disorder. But like you said, I do stuff with Mind. So I help Mind with different projects they have around involving people who are members of Mind in deciding what Mind does on a national level. And that's the same with stuff I do with the NHS. So I think it's really great to write nice policies and things. But if you make all these plans and they don't resonate with people who actually have those experiences, then I think they're not maybe worth the paper they're written on. So being a patient representative, I think, is about representing people on the ground who have to face this in their everyday lives, and how we can make their experiences be at the heart of the decisions that people make at the top. Because I think, people at the top are very far removed sometimes from the realities. So that's a really big part of what I do as a patient representative. And I suppose doing that in different areas, I hope makes a difference. But it's also about helping other people to do that, because I've had my voice heard quite a lot. Like you said, I do a lot of writing, I do a lot of media work, and that's lovely. But I think one of the big things, and especially around eating disorders, is having lots of different voices
Mm.
being heard. So I think, I've got the confidence to talk about my experience, which I didn't used to have at all. I'm really lucky that I have over time got more and more used to doing that. But now that I have done it, I kind of want to encourage other people to, or
Yeah.
help other people to do that in a way that's safe for them. So
Yeah.
involving other people in the conversation, like with Mind, we've run a lot of focus groups, and you might not be able to stand up and talk to a room about your experiences, but you could take part in a different way. And I
Yeah.
think all voices are valid, and we don't have enough of that patient voice sometimes at the table.
Mm.
It's improved a lot, I think. When I first started doing it about 10 years ago, people would be surprised that the patient representative would speak in a meeting, because I think you were there to tick a box. But trying to stop me from speaking in a meeting is quite difficult. I've noticed. But yeah, that's a kind of overview. And I came to Cambridge in the end. Finally got here in the end to do masters in psychology and education. So I was looking more at sort of the way that schools think about mental health,
Right.
because that was a really difficult thing in my life, and my school didn't understand about mental health. But studying that was really interesting, and I do lots of sort of research things after I finished my master's. Research projects. One of them is about using virtual reality to treat depression at University College London. So I think all of these things, they might look a bit messy, or like I do so many different things on paper, and one of them is teaching yoga, which I do online in this room at the moment. But for me, they all come together quite well, because they're
Yeah.
all to do with well-being. They're all to do with maybe different ways of thinking about well-being. You don't see a lot of yoga going on in mental health settings, but I think that
Mm.
it's something
Mm.
that could be really useful.
Yeah.
So I think they all kind of come together quite well. It's just that thing of not taking on too much and managing to have enough time for self-care and everything, which
Yeah.
is something that I'm quite good at now, but I didn't used to be good at it.
That gives us a good opportunity to talk about your own experiences, James. You've talked and reflected on, your role as a campaigner and influencer, your lived experience, your voice. Do you just want to tell us, a bit about your own story and your experience of eating disorder and binge eating?
Sometimes just stories that about mental health in general can be really long and painful and difficult and complicated and lots of ups and downs, and I think it's quite hard to summarize. But I developed OCD when I was about 14, 15. That was a lot around my sort of body appearance, my body image, and my shape, and the way that I looked at other people, and my weight. And so there's quite a lot of overlap actually between symptoms of OCD, obsessions and compulsions, with eating disorder behaviors. And I didn't realize actually that I had a lot of traits of anorexia already. And I developed anorexia when I was about 15. And so being diagnosed sort of helped me to understand what was going on. But I did find it really difficult for anyone to sort of hear me beyond my behavior, and sort of, do you know what I mean, sort of not being just seen as this eating disorder, or being seen as, you've got bad behavior and you have to fix it. And I think that I was quite lucky that I got into child and adolescent services quite fast, but the whole approach was just confrontation. So because at that point I was not eating, and that was the problem, like it was all the time I was just being threatened with, like, if you don't eat, we'll section you. If you're going to carry on doing that, you're going to cause lots of damage to yourself. And I think it was very negative and very confrontational. And that's not really what I needed. What I needed was somebody to listen to me. And I think it came from a good place. And I think that people who try and help people with eating disorders, especially if you don't, have a lot of training in it, I think it is easy to go in and just say, look, you need to change. But
Mm.
before people change, I think they have to feel like they're safe, and there's, good relationships there, and you can trust the people that you're working with. And I didn't really feel that. So I kind of went further and further into the eating disorder, and lost a lot of weight, and became very, very unwell physically as well as mentally. And that was a really difficult experience for my family, who didn't have much support. And back then, we're talking sort of 15 years ago or more, actually, although I don't like to admit it, there were no specialist services for eating disorders in Wales at all
Yeah. Yeah.
at that time. And that's changed a lot. But I look back and I think that was a massive disadvantage for people like me, and a lot of people actually in Wales who needed those treatments at that time, who didn't have them, who
Yeah.
now live with, long-standing problems, or when you do get treatment. And, I went back to Wales about 6 years later. Sort of, I came out of university at 21, having dropped out of university because I was so unwell. And I went back to Wales from Bristol, and I did get treatment then. But by that time, the problem was so entrenched, you know, I'd been living with it for 6, 7 years, that it was much harder to treat. And it was much more sort of deep rooted and had sort of invaded my whole life, really. And my whole life was just this eating disorder. And it changed from anorexia into bulimia. So I gained weight, sort of was forced to eat and everything, which was a really difficult experience because actually I think that in some ways, shutting down my body meant that I didn't have to feel all the difficult things in my body, because emotions are called feelings for a reason, aren't they? We feel them in our body. So if you shut down your body, you don't have to feel those things. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or that we should be doing that, but that's the only thing that I knew what to do at the time. And so when I gained the weight, I felt worse actually. And I think that's when other people around me thought, oh, you're better. And doctors thought, oh, you must be much better. But I felt psychologically, I felt worse, even though like physically I was a lot better. And that's probably when I needed a lot of help, but I didn't have it. And so when I came back, this is several years later, like I tried to go to university after working as a healthcare assistant, and that didn't work out because I took all my problems with me and didn't have any support. So I dropped out and I came back to Cardiff and finally got access to treatment. But it was, the bulimia was so bad by that stage that it was so hard to sort of engage in treatment. And I didn't know how I would cope without binge eating and vomiting. And so like, I think one of the things that I find frustrating about people's understandings of bulimia or binge eating is that they think it's just about eating a little bit too much. And we're actually talking about like massive quantities of food, and it's really dangerous for your stomach and for your throat and for your teeth. And it costs a lot of money if you keep doing this and you have to eat more and more each time. Then I've spent a lot of money on it as well, and that got me in a lot of difficult situations because I wasn't well enough to work, had to be on benefits and housing benefit and everything, and that made me feel a lot worse because I felt really anxious about money all the time as well. So I think things sometimes go together and you have to see the whole picture. But I think a lot of people around me were always really frustrated that I couldn't just somehow think my way out of it, because I did have really good grades in school. I come to Cambridge, I got a place at Cambridge, and if anyone should be able to think their way out of mental health and understand it, it's somebody who goes to Cambridge, isn't it? But we know that it's not just about that. You have to have support. You can't, if you could think your way out of it, then would have done it a long time ago. But I think that you have to have the right treatment when you need it. So that's some of my experiences. And then since that treatment I had in Cardiff, well, it was part of it was in Cardiff and part of it was in Pontypridd because it was split between the two health boards there. That was when I really turned a corner, and I had dialectical behaviour therapy, which is sort of really enhanced version of CBT, I guess, of cognitive behavior therapy. It's really intense. And that's what I needed because the eating disorder was taken up all day, every day. And so if you're going to replace a behavior that's actually really serving a purpose, they exist for a reason and they do have a function, even though they're dangerous, then you're going to need a whole lot of other skills. You're going to need a whole lot of support. So I realized I don't think of myself as like a graduate from Cambridge. I think I'm a graduate from DBT because DBT is like the hardest thing ever. And I did it for 12 months and it did change my life. It didn't make everything better. And I think that that's sometimes frustrating because you have therapy and you sort of want everything to be fixed. And it kind of isn't as easy as that, I think.
So reflecting on your experiences, I've heard you say that there was a period in your life where you weren't accessing services quick enough or they weren't responsive enough for you in that first 7 years, through to accessing DBT and the benefits that brought you. So you've also touched on, that kind of initial threat of needing to eat before being detained under the Mental Health Act. So, your experiences of accessing services sounds incredibly variable. Can you just reflect on the good, the bad, the ugly, and what that meant for you?
Yeah. So I don't want to paint a really negative picture that will make people think, oh, well, there's no point in going to get help, because it's always worth asking for help, even if it can be really difficult. And if you don't get the support that you need, that's really not your fault. But I think that I took that really personally. like I'd gone to the doctor in situations when I felt really at risk, actually. And I think I look back and I think, wow, I was living with really difficult mental symptoms, but also like physical symptoms. And I'm really lucky to still be here. But I think like I took that as, well, you're not worth having help. And that really fed into my self-esteem going down, and actually sometimes made me feel like, well, what I'm going through isn't real. And that really messed with my head, because I felt like, well, if this isn't real, and nobody can understand that, then what is real? And that put me into quite a dangerous place, actually. And I think that I don't want that for other people. So I know that, you know, services don't have the money and the capacity that they should have. But if you do go for support and you don't get it either at the time that you need it, or you just don't get it at all, it doesn't actually reflect on the seriousness of your problem, because everybody deserves support. And
Absolutely.
taking it personally is so, you know, you can't help but feel that that's really unfair, or that that's, you know, that's not right. But it's not because you're not good enough, or that you're especially bad or mad or whatever. It's
Mm.
because the system does have problems. And I've seen that from the inside now with, you know, working at NHS England, that, you know, the people who work in mental health are doing it for all the right reasons. It's just they don't always have the right amount of money. And I suppose that's the ugly side of things for me. And that, I think that's really unfortunate, because if we did have the money, we could tell a very different story about that, hopefully in the future.
Yeah.
But I think
Yeah.
that the good stuff has been sort of when I felt really listened to. And a lot of the time when I've gone for help, it's either been, you know, you've been turned away, or I've been to A&E so many times because my blood tests have been so dangerous that I could just have a cardiac arrest.
Wow.
You know, in those moments of emergency, you kind of need the treatment
Yeah.
really fast, and that does save your life. But that can't be it. Like, I've been in hospital for that and out, and never seen anybody for my mental health, lots of
Mm.
times. And it's great that my life was saved in those situations, but you have to think, well, what kind of a life are you having? And I think that having conversations about, well, you know, how's your mental health in those situations, I really should have had those conversations, and I think they would have really helped. A lot of the time, like you said about, you know, if you don't do this, we'll section you under the Mental Health Act. I think that was really threatening and sort of a negative
Yeah.
motivation. They were obviously trying to help me and scare me into getting better, but I don't think scaring someone into getting better is the best motivation. I think it's better maybe to think, well, like, if you got better, what could you do? What would you like to do? What would you like your life to be like? And I was never asked that until much later on.
Yeah.
And I never heard that recovery was possible until like 6 or 7 years after I developed really severe eating problems. And people told me, you know, you're never going to get better, or you'll live with this for the rest of your life. And I think those messages are really damaging, especially when you're young and you think, well, I've got my
Yeah.
whole life ahead of me, and it's just going to be like this forever. Well, what's the point? I felt like that sometimes. And I think that that's really sad, because with the right help, with the right support, recovery is possible, and it's definitely something that people can aim for if they have the right support. So being really listened to, having positive motivations, and not just being rushed to fix me and to change me straight away. Because, you know, if you have an eating disorder, I think you can be quite ambivalent about change,
Right.
because if I think that my eating disorder was keeping me safe in some ways, and that I didn't have to feel, like I said earlier, like I didn't have to feel these difficult things in my body. And I didn't really know very much else after a while. So changing anyway was going to be really scary. So if I was going to change, it wasn't going to be by somebody telling me you've got to change now. It had to be
Yeah.
through me deciding it for myself, me thinking that it was possible. Because why would you try something if you're going to fail anyway? Because you're just then going to think, oh well, I failed again. I'm really bad, and I'm not going to try again. And I think that I needed time to think about it, time to talk about it. How did I feel about change, or about recovery, rather than just going in and like, we've got to fix it straight away. I
Mm.
know that
Mm.
we want to fix things straight away. Like, as a species, we see a problem, we want to fix it, right?
Yeah.
And that's really good. Like, look at things like vaccines and stuff. That's amazing. It's a miracle. But I think we can't approach mental health in that way all the time, because, you know, for a start, I don't think people are really broken. They do things for like good reasons, I think.
Yeah.
But if you're going to change, you have to respect that that could be really threatening for somebody. It could be really difficult, and having a sense of choice is really important rather than just feeling things are forced on you all the time.
Yeah.
So I think that those are some of the highlights of what's been really difficult and where it's really worked. And sometimes I think of my difficult experiences and think, well, what could I have had, or what would I have liked to have had instead, even if I didn't have it, because then I can think, well, that might help somebody else.
Yeah, and having those insights and listening to your experiences, it's very personal, and the fact that you're able to just talk it through and share it is really helpful. And I think, just to mention, James, ahead of this interview with you, we've asked the kind of mental health community in our area to raise some questions. So we've had some in, and Gareth's going to kick off with asking you some of them.
Yeah, James, I wanted to talk to you about perceptions of eating disorders and stigma around eating disorders. And I think there's a general perception that eating disorders affect women more than men. And I was just wondering how you'd respond to that.
So I think overall they affect women more than men, but we don't really know exactly all the statistics. But I think that it's just unhelpful to think that this is a sort of female condition. But I think that is the way they have been viewed in the past. And when I developed anorexia, like myself personally, I didn't think that was something that could happen to a boy. I thought it was just something that happened to teenage girls, and probably like middle class white teenage girls.
Yeah.
And even doctors around me said stuff like, why do you want to be skinny? Because that's what girls want to look like. And I think that we do have these like historic problems in the way that we look at eating disorders. Because whilst more people in services or people who come forward with eating problems might be women, that might just be because men don't know that it's something that can happen to them too, or people don't pick it up in men, and people don't.
Yeah.
So I think that there are a lot of issues that come with that, because not only does it stop people recognizing they might have a problem and mean that they may get ill and may get even more ill before they finally realize that it's a problem. I think it also affects the way that we treat eating problems, because I look back on my treatment, and the clinics that I went into were pretty flowery and covered in, but one of them was covered in butterflies, one of them was like pink and stuff, and I just thought, well, like I'm into yoga and I love all my goddess stuff and everything, and I'm not the most masculine man, right? But what if I was a gym bro going into the pink butterfly room and sitting there thinking, is this for me? Like, and I think that that's also in the media, isn't it? Because I never saw anybody talk about eating disorders who looks like me when I was growing up, and I really done with that, because one thing that comes with a lot of mental health problems is feeling really isolated and feeling really alone.
Yeah.
And that, I felt like, well, I must be like an alien because I don't see anybody else going through this. This must make me especially bad and make me feel really ashamed. So I think that, the more we see men talking about their experiences as though it's just normal, eating disorders happen to anybody, whatever your background. It's just that some people have had their voices heard longer. Other people, some research has focused more on women's experiences. If you look at a lot of the textbooks, they still say she will, and they have all the female pronouns. I've been given literature in clinics with all female pronouns in it, and leaflets about what to expect when my period starts again, which I found like ridiculous. And funny in one way, you can laugh about it, but nobody's ever talked to me about what happens in terms of sexual function if you're a man. And so I think it's about including people, whatever their background, and this idea that eating disorders are just about skinny, like young, middle-class white girls. I think that doesn't even that does a disservice to everybody, including women, because most eating disorders are not anorexia. Like anorexia is less than 10% of all eating disorders, and the vast majority of people with eating disorders will be normal weight or a bit overweight, and I think it's like 8 or 9% will be underweight. And so the thing that like 9 in 10 people with an eating disorder, you wouldn't be able to see that they had one. So there isn't an image of what an eating disorder looks like. And so I think that, that's really important to bear in mind, rather than just thinking, just because we've heard that story loads of times, or it's always been talking about women's experiences, it can be anybody. And I think that research will start to reflect that. It will take time, but clinics definitely need to take down the butterflies. Having conversations like this.
Yeah. Talking about the stigma, is it, when you were experiencing in disorder initially, did you find, or did you feel that it was something that you had to hide because of potential stigma attached to it?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stigma. I think perhaps something for men is this thing that, oh, it's a female problem, so you must be weak or something. And I think
Yeah.
that can be a problem. And lots of men with eating disorders say that it's quite emasculating, especially these things around, like, you look for information on it and it just talks about women. In general, I think eating disorders have had quite a lot of prejudice in the past, and even in treatment, actually, that we viewed it as sort of a lifestyle choice. And you still hear that sometimes, or that
Yeah.
people are, just taking their diet a bit too far, is kind of trivializing it. And that's not the case. It is really, really serious, and it is, a serious mental health problem.
Yeah.
And I've seen a bit of that actually in some of the work that I've done. And I remember a meeting that I went to once in Cardiff with staff in the NHS. Like, I was a patient representative, but I didn't know any of these people, and they didn't know who I was, and I didn't say anything for a bit. And they sort of were chatting about eating disorders, and somebody said something really, like, stigmatizing, that, oh, I don't want to work with people with eating disorders because they're really manipulative. And, like, I was just there under the radar, and then I let them go on a little bit, and then I said, oh, well, I'm one of those really manipulative people.
Wow.
I'm not saying that everyone thinks that at all, but there are little pockets of that still, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of it's to do with the lack of training, because there isn't a lot of compulsory training for professionals in eating disorders, like very little in medical schools. Most medical schools, they have less than 1 hour of training on eating disorders in their whole 5 or 6 years, which, when you think about how many people they affect, we think it's like, up to 10% of people. And that's a lot. You don't see that for other conditions where they have like 1 hour of training. And so when people don't have the training, they try and fill in the gaps with their prejudice or with their assumptions, don't they?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they've always been told this view that eating disorders are trivial, or this like silly fad that girls go through, or that people with eating disorders are manipulative because they can be, resistant to treatment or change because they feel really frightened. That's not being manipulative. That's being, like, in a lot of pain, or being really frightened of change, or really suffering, actually.
Yeah.
So I think we've blamed people with eating disorders for their problems for quite a long time.
Yeah.
And we need to stop doing that.
And I think, you've touched on a number of times now throughout this discussion that, eating disorders, it's not about food. It's a serious mental health condition that, that needs to be addressed in that way. And that probably fuels the stigma, and I would just wanted to ask you, from our point of view as a mental health charity, what could we do to challenge that stigma, or what work could we be doing to increase people's awareness of eating disorders?
I think it's about having conversations where you're not afraid to talk about it. And I think a lot of people do still feel scared of talking about eating disorders because they don't know what to say, or they think they're going to put their foot in it and say the wrong thing, or that they're not experts in eating disorders, so they don't have a right to talk about it. But I think actually, if we normalize it, it means we can all talk about it. And people who might really need to talk about it are more likely to talk about it. So having open conversations about, even if it's just about food or eating or exercise or body image, and checking in with, like, what are our relationships with those things like? Because lots of people I talk to say they can't understand eating disorder, they just don't get it. And I'm like, well, we all have mental health, right? And sometimes it goes up and down, and sometimes it's really bad for a while, and that's a mental health problem. But we all have a relationship with food and eating, and we know what it's like for that to go a bit disorganized. Just have to think about Christmas or something. And we know what it's like for, our exercise relationship with exercise and our body image. It sort of goes up and down for everybody, but for some people it will become like a really significant problem. And maybe they're predisposed to it, and then it happens to be in the right environment that it comes out as a real significant problem. And so it's not something we can't relate to, because we all have that relationship with food, exercise, eating. We all have to do it. It's just that in some people it becomes a real problem. So we need to be confident to talk about it and to talk about how we feel about it, our emotions about it, and not be scared of the subject. Because if we show that we're scared of these subjects, then people will keep up their silence, I think. And that silence in eating disorders can really harm people, and it can, people die from eating disorders. And I think that, if we can encourage people to talk sooner, then it could make a difference and it could save lives. And it sounds a bit like, wishy-washy to say that, but actually some of these conversations can save people's lives.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
And how will you, continue to use your influence for better understanding and treatment options for people with eating disorders? I know you're an active writer. You've had pieces published in the British Medical Journal. So is this something that you are hoping to continue?
Yeah, definitely. So I love writing, and I'm currently co-editing a book on eating disorders. So it's the practical handbook of eating disorders, with lots of different experiences in there, clinical experiences, lived experience. I hope that will make a difference. It's not going to be a bestseller, but the people who might need to read it might read it. I think it's about doing what you can, isn't it? Because it is a big challenge to make sure everybody has the eating disorder treatment they need. And it's about recognizing that you can do your bit, but maybe you can't do the whole thing on your own. And that's like what we were saying about, knowing your limits, knowing your boundaries. So it's definitely something I'm really committed to. And, I do a lot of work with NHS England and, try and get involved in writing the guidelines for these things and trying to call for more funding and doing that sort of political lobbying, where we're trying to get people who've got the power to make these decisions, to think that mental health is really serious and that it's worth spending money on. So I'll keep doing that, and I think it'd be difficult to stop me from keep blabbing about that and keep campaigning about that. But I think I'll also carry on sort of looking after my own well-being and thinking about that, mental health is viewed quite narrowly sometimes, and the options for people are generally like, oh, you can have medication or you can have this therapy, or like a choice of like one or two therapies if you're lucky. And actually I think that the bigger picture is important too. Of course, like specialist treatment is really important when you need it, but it's also important to think about what you enjoy and to think about what hobbies you have, your social connections with other people. And I think when I look at my recovery, like getting back into a sense of community has been as important to my recovery as like, when I took medication. Or I've started, more recently doing yoga and dance, and that's been really helpful for me because I used to have a really difficult relationship with exercise. So I had to think, well, how can I make this a more positive relationship? And now doing my yoga is like going to therapy. So things for different people. It might be gardening. For my mum, it's gardening. She goes in the garden and she's at peace, and otherwise she has quite a lot of anxiety. And it's about thinking, well, there's space for all of these things in mental health. Mental health doesn't have to be this narrow thing or this one size that fits everybody, because there isn't one size that fits everybody. And everybody's really different. It's the same with eating disorders. There's no one presentation of an eating disorder. Everybody's is different because every person is different.
Yeah.
All the time.
James, you've done an amazing job in terms of reflecting and telling us your own story. You've reflected on your experiences of services, your campaigning role, your lobbying role, the writing that you do. If there was, now that we've reflected on your journey, if there was something that you could say to your 16-year-old self, what would that be?
It's so long ago now, I can't remember. I think, what would I say? There would be lots of things. I would try not to be angry with myself, because I think I would just, part of me would be really frustrated and be like, what are you doing? Like, snap out of it. And that makes me, understand why people can sometimes be frustrated with people. And my parents must have had such a difficult time, I think, with me as a teenager, because I can't imagine how hard it is when your child is so unwell, and you don't feel like you can do anything to help them. So I try to be understanding and be compassionate. That would be my first thing. But what would I say? I think I would say that it will get better, but you just can't see it at the moment. and that there is a different kind of life, even though your life is like completely overwhelmed by the eating disorder. Because I think when you're in it and when it's completely overwhelmed everything, it can be so hard to see outside of it and to even imagine that there's another way of living. And that was why it was so scary to try and change. And so I think that I would remind myself that, you know, it is possible, even if it feels impossible. And that would give me hopefully a little bit of hope. And I would also say, like, you know, if you're not getting the help that you need, and I said this earlier, but it's not your fault, and it's not because you're particularly bad or you don't deserve it or you're not worthy. It's because, unfortunately, we live in an age, or I did then, and it's a bit better now, but we still do live in an age where we don't get the same treatment for mental health as we do for our physical health. And I've seen that with eating disorders. Like when I've had a physical health problem from the eating disorder, get help straight away.
Yeah.
But for the mental side of it, no. And we have to wait a lot longer. And so I would be compassionate. I would remind myself that there is hope. And I would say that what you're going through is not your fault, both in like getting help and, you know, not being able to get the help, but also just having the problems in the first place. Like it wasn't my fault that happened. I felt like that for a long time that it was.
Yeah.
I definitely felt that when I was 16, but it wasn't. And I think that, you know, letting go of that blame is a really big part of recovery. So if I could hurry that up a little bit, I might save myself a few years of misery.
Yeah. So on that then, James, if there was one piece of advice to the listeners to this video podcast, what would it be?
I'm going to be really cheeky and try and go for two.
Right, that's fine.
Go for it.
I think there's like, depends on who's listening. If there's somebody listening who has struggles with an eating disorder themselves, I think I would say that, you know, you're doing the best that you can with the resources you have in that moment. Like, and I think that, you know, it's so easy to judge people for not trying or for not getting better. And actually, I believe that people are doing the best they can all the time. It's just that sometimes you don't have the right tools and sometimes you don't have the right support, and that's not your fault. So I'd say that, you know, and if somebody listening is living with an eating disorder, you know that it's really, really hard work to live with it and to recover from it. So, you know, you're doing the best that you can. I think that I would emphasize that. And if somebody was listening and they were supporting somebody with an eating disorder, or they were just interested in knowing more about eating disorders to think, how can they help other people and be a good sort of advocate, I think I would just tell them that you don't have to be a specialist to have awareness of eating disorders. It's not about like being able to say what all the different eating disorders are and what all the different characteristics are. I think it's about being able to listen and being able to have conversations where you can listen without having to know all the answers. We put a lot of pressure on ourselves to be experts about a subject in order to talk about it, but you really don't have to be. I think that what you need to be able to do is to listen to somebody and to just like hold what they're saying and to have compassion, and that's enough. Like, you're not going to fix somebody with an eating disorder. That's not even your job. If you're supporting somebody, you're there as a friend, as a supporter. Like, you're not a specialist, and that doesn't mean that what you can offer isn't as valuable. It can be just as valuable, even more valuable. Everybody needs to know that they're cared for and that they're worth being listened to. And I think if you can do that for somebody with their mental health in general, then you're giving them a real gift. Even though you're not necessarily trained for it, you're drawing on your compassion and your human qualities. And I think that, you know, services sometimes at their worst don't have enough human qualities in them. And that if we can be really good friends to each other, that doesn't necessarily make up for what people need in services, but I think it can make a huge difference.
So a key message from you as we end this conversation is to keep talking. Don't be afraid to talk about eating disorders, and, you know, to just access the support services that are available. And I think by way of concluding this, you know, you've reflected on accessing services through your GP, but we will also post, as well as you know, other other specialist services that you've accessed, but by way of ensuring that people have access to appropriate information and advice around eating disorders, we'll just ask people to follow the link that we'll publish on this video podcast. James, it's been an absolute pleasure having the opportunity to spend this time with you, giving your insights, your experience. You talk openly, honestly, and frankly about your experiences by way of supporting others. And please continue to do all of the great work that you're doing in relation to your campaigning, your lobbying, your writing. And it's been an absolute privilege to spend time with you.
Yeah, thank you, James.
Thank you, and thanks for taking an interest and helping people have these conversations, because it makes a really big difference, and we need more of these spaces, especially with eating disorders, and I hope that it helps people.